Caution. You are about to hear
today's news talk and the voice of freedom.
That's what this country's all about.
TNT Radio.
Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to TNT, Today's News Talk. I'm Patrick Henningsen, your host. Thank you for rejoining us for this live broadcast. We're still in hour number one. We're going to be switching gears right now to the U.S. politics, and I want to welcome onto the program an independent journalist on the ground in the United States who's been doing some spectacular coverage on the campaign trail so far in the 2024 election cycle. A fascinating take on things. Michael Tracey is joining us on the line right now from the U.S. Michael, welcome to the program.
Hello. Thanks for having me on.
No, it's our pleasure, Michael. And there's a couple of things that I definitely want to hear your views on. We'll talk about the 2024 election cycle, but let's cut right to the chase. The big story that everybody is talking about right now in the U.S. is Tucker Carlson's interview with Vladimir Putin, which is due to be broadcast today on X, formerly known as Twitter. And I want to get your take on this. There's been a huge reaction. I mean, some incredible things have been said about Tucker Carlson, what should be done as a reaction to this interview by Tucker. Just your feelings and thoughts on this, your observations, Michael.
Yeah, I wrote an article about this for Newsweek a few days ago, 2 days ago now. And obviously, my perspective is that it's straightforward and undeniable that anybody who has an opportunity to interview a significant world leader should seize that opportunity. I didn't even realize that was such a controversial point, but apparently it is. And on the Newsweek homepage, accompanying my article, or like adjacent to it, there's blaring headlines about how some EU official is saying that Tucker Carlson could be sanctioned for going to Russia to interview Putin. On what exact grounds, I'm not exactly sure, but there probably will be some clamor for that, given how hysterical people get about just the mere fact of being in Putin's presence and interviewing him. I mean, it wasn't that long ago that Putin was actually relatively accessible to American and Western media outlets, more than you might expect, and people might find it a little bit surprising now. But in 2021, he did an almost 90-minute interview with NBC. Keir Simmons of NBC News, live from Russia. It was very extensive, very detailed. And I recall Putin actually extending the period of time that he was sitting for the interview mid-interview. So it went longer than it was scheduled for. And he has done long interviews with the Financial Times. What people seem to be objecting to now so maniacally is not anything to do with the interview itself, because we haven't seen it yet. No one has, as far as I know. So they can't be objecting to the content of the interview. They're objecting to the principle of Tucker Carlson being in Russia and interviewing Putin. So you'll have people who are like claiming that they're the guardians of journalistic ethics or something, screeching with such fervor in denunciation of this interview before they could have possibly had a chance to see it. So ironically, they're the ones who are contradicting standard journalistic ethics because they're prejudging something that they haven't necessarily been able to see, which is kind of insane. And the idea that it's preferable for American or Western audiences to continue to have almost zero direct access to Putin, at least in terms of a media interview, because he's not done one for an English-speaking audience that I know of since before the Ukraine war started in February 2022. The idea that it would be preferable for that lack of exposure to continue is just crazy, considering that bilateral relations between the two leading global nuclear superpowers are at a historic low. So any increase in interchange between the countries' political classes or cultural classes, or in this case, media classes, would seem to me to be preferable than for relations to just continue to crater with no mitigation at all. So that's my initial reaction.
There's a couple of things that I noticed in the sort of conversation surrounding this, Michael. One of them is there's a lot of concern that somehow this is going to influence the 2024 election. You've probably seen some of these comments as well. I can't understand how that could be, but they're afraid that Tucker has opened the door to the American psyche or the American mind or the cultural space. The military experts are calling it the fifth generation warfare space, and Tucker's allowing Putin into the minds of Americans in a very fragile election year. I don't like the sound of this, Michael, because this sounds crazy, and this is only step one of crazy on this election cycle. You've been covering this election too, so you probably have some special insights on this. What do you think about that sort of accusation?
Well, man, I mean, there's something psychologically irreparable about the media's take on things that could allegedly help Trump, because they're always dot connecting and trying to discern patterns of like phenomena out in the natural universe that they can claim in some convoluted way helps Trump. And if they can make that claim, then whatever is supposedly helping Trump must be furiously denounced, because that's the embodiment of pure evil. So this is just a continuation of that. I don't see any plausible case or a rational case that Putin doing an interview in February of 2024 is going to help Donald Trump like win Wisconsin in November of 2024. Like, what's like the chain of events there that people are suggesting is somehow going to be such a political boon to Trump? But you're right. I mean, people are making this reflexive point. My debate counterpart on Newsweek, because they set it up as a debate, that I was making like the pro-journalism argument and the other journalist was making the anti-journalism argument, strangely enough. He made a similar argument that in some way he didn't exactly specify. Just the mere fact of Tucker Carlson interviewing Putin is going to redound to the political benefit of Donald Trump, and therefore it must be, presumptively denounced as this grave, offense to the American body politic or something. And he actually said that Putin should not be interviewed at all. Whether by Tucker or anyone else, it's hard to say. I mean, these people don't really have a lot of precision in how they formulate their arguments. But he was saying we're better off not having any interview with Putin at all, because Russia already has enough influence on the American psyche through its manipulation of the internet and through other propaganda mechanisms that it has at its disposal. I don't know if my observation comports with yours, but the idea that Russia has this highly sophisticated propaganda apparatus seems like it's probably not the truest thing at this point, because whatever else you think about the Ukraine war, it seems like for at least much of it, the Russian state propaganda apparatus, such as it exists, has been dwarfed by the pro-Ukraine propaganda apparatus. So the idea that it was this fearsome, influencer of external public opinion seems like it's been disproven by the events of the past 2 years. But people are so convinced of this because, remember, they think that the Russian propaganda apparatus is so omnipotently powerful that it installed Donald Trump as president in 2016. They haven't been disabused of that belief. So if that's the grandiosity with which they view the supposed online manipulation threat, then it's not surprising that they're continue to, pattern detect, and they're applying the same blinker logic to the forthcoming interview with Tucker and Putin.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of circular logic at play, where the base assumptions from 2016 are still looming large in the minds of many Americans, unfortunately. But isn't it a case, Michael, that they've heavily censored any Russian statements or foreign ministry statements or Putin or whoever, Russian media full stop? It doesn't really exist in the West for all intents and purposes. The URLs have been banned in Europe, so it doesn't exist there. It's not on YouTube. They took it off. But isn't it a case that the thing that you ban, if you get into this censorship game, including this interview with Tucker, the reactions have guaranteed it's going to be the highest rated program of the year. The thing that you ban, there's going to be this kind of, curiosity and craving by people to want to see it. That's also at play here, do you think?
Yeah, I don't know that it's so much brute force censorship in the United States. This is different from Europe, where there has been overt state censorship of Russian state media outfits and more heavy-handed censorship tactics than are really quite as permissible in the United States. There probably are some instances of outright censorship in the U.S. that aren't springing to mind right now, but I think it's slightly more subtle and then even perhaps more insidious in the U.S. in some ways, just because of the First Amendment protections. I mean, like RT, I think is technically still available on just cable packages, right? Now it can be kind of buried, it can be de-emphasized, and maybe that's just as effective in terms of curtailing its reach. But it's not quite the same as the situation in Europe. I mean, I remember being in Poland shortly after the invasion of Ukraine and scrolling through like the dial of the TV monitor. And then if you go onto RT, which is like a pretty high ranked channel at that time, it was just a black screen. It was kind of eerie. So yeah, I mean, they can't ban or censor this Tucker Carlson interview, right? I mean, we're told that Elon Musk has given an assurance that it will be made available and not de-amplified on Twitter. I mean, if anything, they'll probably amplify it just because Tucker has this, arrangement along with a few others with Twitter or X to produce media. And it's more about the preemptive declarations that this is some kind of horrible taboo, or that Tucker has done something nefarious just by dint of going to Russia with the intent of interviewing Putin. So it's the uproar that's preceding the publication of the interview that I think is going to engender extra attention. I mean, obviously, with Putin not having done a Western or U.S.-oriented interview for so long, it was going to get a ton of attention anyway. But the screeching and the histrionics that came first, of course, only heightened the anticipation for the actual interview. So, yeah, often these people the people who are having that hysterical reaction are not the most rational actors, because if they were rational actors and they really didn't want this out, then they would just play it cool or just not go excessively crazy, and then maybe that would temper some of the anticipation of it and maybe limit its reach. But they've ensured that it's going to have maximum reach now. So
I think I've been looking at Ukrainian Twitter as well. They're saying that this isn't a legitimate interview because the questions aren't being vetted like they would with a mainstream media outlet. There's no vetting. I see this word being used a lot. So
vetted by whom?
by somebody in a dark suit in the back of the control room. I don't know, but
they were like BBC Ofcom to vet or something.
Yeah,
really, some quasi-governmental authority should be able to technocratically vet the questions.
Yeah, broadcasting authority or a watchdog or something like that. So what does this say about, because these set piece interviews, Michael, used to be Mike Wallace, Barbara Walters, Christiane Amanpour. They had a kind of monopoly on these set piece interviews. Peter Arnett interviewed Osama bin Laden. So the mainstream media organizations, News Corp, these big corporations, they're not getting these opportunities. This is incredible. If you think about these billion-dollar media conglomerates, they can't land these interviews, but Tucker lands it. Isn't that do you think that's more about what the uproar is about? This is the establishment having a sort of, lashing out at what's clearly a trend that's moving in a direction that's not in their favor. What do you think?
Yeah, I think the uproar is multi-pronged. So what Christiane Amanpour said is that Tucker is lying, or Tucker's not telling the truth, because in his introductory video from 2 days ago or whatever it was, Tucker did say that no American journalist or Western journalist has bothered to interview Putin since the invasion of Ukraine. And of course, because they're obsessed with just kind of trivialities, journalists latched onto that, and there were angry monologues on CNN primetime saying that Tucker was lying because outlets like CNN or the BBC or whatever, NBC, ABC, they have technically probably submitted interview requests to the Kremlin communications department seeking to interview Putin. So they have sought to interview Putin, but then that got conflated as, according to the outraged journalists, them never even attempting to interview Putin, and maybe like Tucker's phrasing of that or framing of that was, angled in a certain way for emphasis. But the point is, nobody has successfully obtained an interview with Putin until now, and it's Tucker who's obtained it. So yeah, that's automatically going to produce revulsion on the part of the journalists who think that it's their rightful own. It's rightfully theirs to interview Putin or to have a major interview like this, and Tucker getting it is a subversion of their like journalistic authority or something, or cultural political authority, and it is. I mean, they're right to observe that it is in a way, because Tucker does not have corporate backing at this point, and yet, well, I mean, I guess he does maybe in a way because he has the arrangement with X, but he doesn't have a major corporate broadcasting backing. And to subvert the typical way that an interview like this would be organized or engineered is kind of a threat to just the basic business model of the people who are freaking out about it. So that's one element of why there's such an uproar. But I also think secondarily, the probably more salient aspect of the uproar is that they just see the notion of Tucker interviewing Putin, going to Russia interviewing Putin as itself to be treasonous or objectionable. Again, they don't even have to see the interview itself. They don't have to see the final journalistic product to know that they're outraged by it. So, I mean, you can imagine somebody else. I don't know, like a Don Lemon. He has an arrangement with X now, right, as well. So if maybe somehow, for whatever crazy series of events, he was the one who ended up in Moscow interviewing Putin, would there be such a blithering frenzy of outrage? I don't think so, because Don Lemon probably would have taken a kind of more conventional approach to the interview. Don Lemon wouldn't be seen as having any kind of ideological affinity with Putin, where that's assumed as a given with Tucker. Whether that's true or not, I don't know exactly. I doubt it, but that's the kind of unexamined assumption. So I don't think it's entirely about how the traditional model of how an interview like this would be orchestrated has been undermined. It's more about Tucker himself representing something that is seen as inherently evil, and he's not going to Russia to interview Putin or to commit an act of journalism. They're claiming that he's going there to do the PR bidding of Putin, who they view as the next iteration of Hitler, and so therefore it's just this smorgasbord of pure evil. There's nothing journalistic about it, according to them.
One thing I can say about Tucker Carlson that he does that a lot of good journalists do and have done in the past is that he questions what the U.S. foreign policy is. He questions whether we should be, as a country, embroiled in various wars or situations, quagmires, and so forth. He's done that consistently with a number of conflicts, not just Ukraine. So there is a pattern with Tucker of literally questioning overseas interventions. So that's also a big problem, because he will air a view from Moscow, from the Russian president, about how the war is going. And because we've been told, Michael, in America for 2 years that the war is going really well, victory is around the corner, Russia's been brought to their knees economically, all of these things, Tucker threatens potentially here to upend a lot of these, or at least get people to question or re-examine some of these assumptions. I think this is like really triggering people on a deep level politically who don't want this interview to happen. What do you think they're going to be talking about? Do you think some of these things are going to come out in the process of this? I think it's an hour. He said it's going to be 1 hour unedited.
Yeah. I thought I might even have seen 2 hours. I'm not sure. We'll see later today. And that would be a long interview. And to put it out unedited, I think, is also something that people will increasingly demand, because the format of having to insert commercial breaks or to clip an interview so it neatly aligns with the broadcast demands of a traditional nightly news show is becoming archaic. When most people are going to, especially people who are younger. I mean, what is the average age of a Fox News viewer at this point? Tucker's former employer, like 63, probably. I mean, they're aging out of there being a demand for that kind of formatting any longer, and rightly so, or thankfully so, because it's ridiculous with all the technology we have available now that there should be such an arbitrary, cluttering of an interview with needless editing and commercials and whatever. So that's good. In March of 2022, I was in Eastern Europe, Poland, right as the war was starting, and I was reporting on the deployments of U.S. military battalions right in the vicinity of Ukraine in southeastern Poland, in Yeshiv in southeastern Poland. There's now like a major hub of U.S. military and NATO logistics that was only beginning to form when I was first there. And I was trying to go and talk. I was attempting to visit some of these newly constructed military installations. So I just showed up to one and was, talking to some of the U.S. and Polish military who were there. And I was told that there was a gag order, or there was a media gag order in place, so that none of the U.S. military who were there were to speak to any media whatsoever about what they were doing. And I was on Tucker's show, going on Tucker's show that night, and his producers confirmed with the Pentagon that there was, in fact, a gag order in place at these newly constructed military installations in Poland, right in the direct vicinity of the war zone. And that hadn't been reported in U.S. media yet. And yet, what did Tucker's team do there in conjunction with me? That was just a straightforward act of journalism. They got confirmation from the government that they were doing something of consequence that had not yet been disclosed to the public. So when you have CNN anchors or others screaming that Tucker can't possibly be a journalist, and we can't look at this as a forthcoming journalistic interview, I mean, there's just plenty of contradicting evidence showing that he has committed acts of journalism. I mean, whether you like him or dislike him is kind of immaterial to whether he does journalistic work. I mean, they love to try to police who could be rightly classified as a journalist, as though that makes a difference to anybody, or if it's like some vaunted societal status. I mean, you could be a piece of crap and a journalist. I mean, and it doesn't, like, they're not contradictory. Or you could be like, a saint and a journalist. So they're going to try to get people bogged down in that debate, which is ridiculous. I think it would be rational. I mean, let's say hypothetically, I doubt this will happen. I can't imagine that Tucker will be as sycophantic with Putin as your average, Fox host now is with Donald Trump, or like NBC host is with Joe Biden. But let's say hypothetically he is. Let's say he just decides that he's a huge fan of Putin and just wants to completely kiss his ass for 2 hours. That would be worth reasonably scrutinizing, because Putin is a powerful world figure and should be subject to rational journalistic inquiry just like anybody else. But we have no evidence that that's happened yet. People, again, are just objecting to just the mere principle of the interview being conducted. So, yeah, I mean, obviously, what you'd want to, if you want to have an accurate understanding of any world conflict, leave aside that it's Russia, Ukraine, or NATO, Russia at this point, wouldn't you want to have the most comprehensive understanding as possible of what the motives are for each warring party? I mean, the idea that it's bad to consume or to gather that information is a pure propaganda perspective, because people aren't objecting to this because they, on journalistic grounds, because on journalistic grounds, you would want to have as much information as possible about the nature of the conflict. And this is a big missing piece, at least for Western audiences, for the past 2 years. Obviously, you can read a Putin speech if you want, but like not that many people in just the ordinary American public are probably going to be moved to like go to the Kremlin English translation website, like read transcripts of his speeches or something. They'd have to have it sort of filtered to them by the tastemakers or the people who are, regulating sort of information consumption. And now that that's happening, that's a big kind of black hole that's being at least partially filled, which anybody who's just interested in better understanding the basics of the conflict should celebrate. And if you're condemning it, then you're operating from a propaganda perspective, not a journalistic one, which again is ironic, because these people who are castigating Tucker Carlson are going to run around claiming the mantle of journalistic integrity when they're really doing the opposite.
No, there's a lot of that going on right now. The aftermath of this is going to be very interesting to read. What's in the Washington Post, the final, these sort of op-eds that are coming. They've probably already been written, Michael. A lot of these op-eds, even before
I could pre-write one in my sleep.
That's the sad truth of it. Look, we're going to take a break.
As I said in my Newsweek item 2 days ago, these people haven't had an original thought since the Steele dossier.
It's debatable whether those were original thoughts anyway. But
yeah, that's true. I should modify my statement.
I'm with Michael Tracey, independent journalist. We're talking about the uproar surrounding Tucker Carlson's interview with Vladimir Putin. It's been deemed verboten right across the Western political and media spectrum. But when we come back, Michael has also had a look on the 2024 election campaign trail. The GOP side is very interesting, but somewhat strange as well. This is a very odd election cycle. I want to get Michael's take on that and more on the other side. This is TNT, today's News Talk. I'm Patrick Henningsen, your host. We'll be right back after these messages.
De-weaponizing weather with reality and perspective.
So I'm in Atlanta, Georgia, because I'm doing a climate roundtable tomorrow. I'm assuming that the network that invited me on is probably the only network that's left around this part of the country that actually allows climate skeptics to be on. It'll be interesting because I'm sure there are going to be some people there to challenge me. In any case, when I walked into the hotel, the person at the front desk was from Adelaide, Australia, the city of churches. See, I learned something, right? And I got to thinking that maybe tomorrow I will spring on the people that are there for almost unprecedented climate events that have occurred around Australia that are very, very important around the climate. Now, not directly with Australia, but north of Australia, the typhoon season, despite the fact that we supposedly had an El Nino going, was way, way below normal. Third lowest ever. That's very unusual. And that was the first hint that this El Nino wasn't what it was cracked up to be. As a matter of fact, the Southern Oscillation Index, which is the longest running metric of the El Nino, never got into El Nino category this year until now. But that was unprecedented when you had what we call the Oceanic Nino Index being so strong. That's two unprecedented things. Number three, the crash that is occurring in the Southern Oscillation Index is going to be the greatest on record from January to February. In fact, it may be the greatest on record from 1 month to another. It is unprecedented to see January with an above SOI and then February crashing the way this is. Now, in 1978, we had a weak El Nino going, and then it crashed in February. By the way, they had all those floods in Los Angeles in 78. How about that? The fourth thing, the unprecedented warming of the ocean just to the east of Australia in a month or two. See that? Tonight's Climate and Weather Watchdog was all about Australia. It's because I ran into someone from Adelaide. This is TNT Climate and Weather Watchdog meteorologist Joe Bastardi asking you to enjoy the weather. It's the only weather you got.
This is the Patrick Henningsen Show on TNT Radio.
Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back. It is Thursday. We are still in the first hour of this live broadcast. Really appreciate you guys joining us right now. And hello to our listeners and viewers and everybody in the TNT chat community. That's the little red bubble in the lower right-hand part of the screen. We go to the URL tntradio.live. You can also access it through the app, which you can download on the Google Play and the Apple Store as well. We have a big crowd in there. Really appreciate you guys. Getting consistently high numbers, over 150 to 200 in our chat community during the show. These are great. So that's where you want to be during the program. We'll be interacting with you in there shortly as well. Back onto the program, however, let's bring Michael Tracey, independent journalist from the United States, onto the stage. And Michael, we've also noticed you've been on the campaign trail on this 2024 election cycle, and you're kind of almost reporting it. I don't know. I like your style. You're going a bit gonzo, a la Hunter Thompson, where you're getting right in there and seeing things and reporting things that most of the mainstream media aren't really paying attention to. What's your observation so far that you've seen on the 2024 election?
Well, I'm not taking LSD and infiltrating any campaigns or anything, so maybe
Right.
not quite gonzo of the traditionally understood methods. But yeah, I mean, there are a couple of underreported things, I think. So, for example, in New Hampshire, where I was 2 weeks ago now, or when was that? Yeah, about 2 weeks ago.
Yeah.
Were a couple of things. First of all, the Democratic National Committee and the Joe Biden reelection campaign did something that was pretty unprecedented, actually literally unprecedented, which is that they went out of their way specifically to sabotage the New Hampshire primary, which actually has a long history of being a pretty interesting exercise in Democratic choice, because people might not be aware of this, but New England and New Hampshire in particular has a pretty unique style of self-governance within the United States. They have very granular town hall style government where citizens of small towns go and become like the de facto legislatures of their towns for a session to approve ordinances and things. And from that grows a very engaged kind of citizen ethic in terms of state and local governments, government, and also national government. I'm not saying it's perfect. I'm not trying to idealize it necessarily, but of all the states in the union, New Hampshire is probably a decent one to go first in a presidential primary process if you have to pick one. And Joe Biden happened to come in 5th place in New Hampshire in 2020 when he ran for the Democratic nomination that year. And so the DNC, in conjunction with the Biden campaign, within the past year or two, maneuvered to strip New Hampshire of delegates, essentially, by saying that it was no longer entitled to its first in the nation status, which it has actually codified in its state statutes, because they were arguing that there needs to be a more diverse electorate that kicks everything off. And that happened to just coincidentally be South Carolina, where Biden won like a big victory in 2020. And that basically skyrocketed him to eventually getting the nomination. So it was a pure political play, but they tried to frame it as out of their concern for increasing diversity or something, which is just a farce. And they went to some pretty extreme lengths to suppress the primary. I mean, the DNC sent a threat letter essentially to the New Hampshire Democratic Party saying that you are required to inform the public that this election is meaningless and that candidates should not participate. So they were ordering, like the Central Party Committee was ordering the state party to essentially suppress the vote, or to engage in voter suppression tactics, or tactics that in virtually any other circumstance, if you could imagine, if it was Republicans doing it, Democrats would cry foul, and rightly so, as voter suppression. I mean, imagine if it was like a minority group that the Republicans were targeting that at or something. And yet it got very little attention in media coverage. There's like one, Dean Phillips, who's a Democratic congressman with pretty generic views, that is technically running against Biden and did so in New Hampshire. He's called attention to it, but he's seen as kind of a marginal figure, which he is. And it didn't get a whole lot of critical coverage, which it should, because it completely flies in the face of the main Democratic Party campaign message ever since the dawn of the age of Trump, which is that they're these stalwart, heroic defenders of democracy, and they have to ward off like the hordes of the anti-democratic insurgents or insurrectionists personified by Trump and the MAGA movement, because they want to abolish democracy. Well, I mean, they started off this whole campaign cycle by essentially sabotaging the first major democratic exercise in the process. And this is like a pretty storied tradition in New Hampshire going back, many decades. So that was one thing. There is also, there's interesting sentiment that I tried to pick up on from the Trump voter. A lot of just going to be generic Republicans who are following the Republican standard bearer. But you do see some shifts in messaging. Like there were people who volunteered to me that they viewed Trump as the best candidate because he's going to prevent World War III, or because he didn't start any wars. I think there's ways that you can quibble with those talking points, which Trump and his campaign apparatus have actually been going with and promoting. But the very fact that that's a salient political message with the Republican frontrunner. Is a notable shift. I would make probably some substantive criticisms of those claims because, a lot of what we're seeing in Ukraine now actually was foretold by actions of the Trump administration. Go look at Putin's speech in February of 2022. A lot of his grievances that he cites with U.S. policy occurred under the Trump administration. And, Trump has said stuff like last summer, he did an interview where he's saying, his position on Ukraine really has no detail to it other than Trump is claiming that it, number one, never would have happened if he was president, and number two, he'll get it all solved in 24 hours. So we don't apparently need to know anything other than that in terms of policy specifics, in terms of Trump, how Trump would handle the issue. But he did give a little bit of more detail during one interview a few months ago where he said that he would tell Putin that if he doesn't accept the U.S. imposed deal, that Trump would threaten to send Ukraine even more weapons than ever before. And then just more recently, a week or two ago in Nevada, Trump was campaigning ahead of the caucuses, which I think it might be today. Trump was saying that he was basically going to do what Ron DeSantis campaigned on doing. Ron DeSantis had a completely inchoate position on Ukraine because he was always trying to triangulate, and he was always trying to not 100% offend the more anti-interventionist or Ukraine skeptical contingent of the Republican electorate, but also try to remain in good standing with the more hawkish or pro-interventionist element. He was always trying to tread or walk that fine line, and never really did it convincingly. So he always just ended up basically incoherent on the subject. But what he would say when he was prompted to answer the question, to kind of give the vague indication that he was somehow intervention skeptical, was he was saying Europe needs to step up their game. We need to pressure the EU to spend more on Ukraine than we are, or equal our funding commitment, because it's more important for them than it is for us, which is not like an anti-interventionist statement. It's actually saying the U.S. should cajole or pressure Europe into increasing their interventionism in Ukraine. And so that's typically what DeSantis went with when he was addressing the subject. And Trump basically repeated almost an exact version of that in a speech that he made. I happened to be listening to that speech. I tweeted out a clip of it, and people went insane. I mean, Robert F. Kennedy actually used it as a basis for saying he'll actually end the war, where Trump will continue it. So it's kind of interesting how that. It'll be interesting to observe how and if Trump's messaging on Ukraine in particular shifts now that he's effectively the nominee. He was always on course to be the nominee, with almost 100% certainty, but now that it's actually verified by election results, it'll be interesting to see as he begins to court more of his previous donors who were against him in 2016 and came around and then were for him in 2020 and then were toying with some other Republican potentially for 2024. Now that they're being brought back into the fold, can you maybe discern some kind of shift in how Trump is at least rhetorically addressing this issue? Not that his rhetoric necessarily amounts to all that much in terms of significance, but that'd be worth bearing in mind.
Do you think Nikki Haley and DeSantis, do you think there's an element that they're auditioning for a possible vice presidential slot or cabinet position or something? Because those are two very pro-establishment candidates, but they don't have the popular appeal that Trump has. What about this Haley phenomenon? We got a couple minutes left. I'll give you the floor for the final 3 minutes, Mike. Go ahead.
Yeah, obviously, I think if Ron DeSantis or Nikki Haley were offered the vice presidency, they would take it. Almost any ambitious politician would, regardless of what they say. Are they auditioning for it? I kind of doubt it. I think Ron DeSantis seems to be running more of a shadow campaign, or he's doing stuff in Florida now, which has no direct relation to Florida state government. He's going to press conferences and making big statements about Israel, Palestine, and criticizing the Biden administration for allegedly floating a two-state or a Palestinian state, which I don't think they're really even doing. That's more of just a PR tactic. But he was going out of his way to criticize that, and what does it got to do with saving the Everglades or something? Not a whole lot, I don't think. And then Haley, I don't know that she's auditioning for vice president at this point, because I think Trump has made clear that he's seeking somebody who's going to be more pliable or more deferential to him and to continue a campaign against him at this point. probably is not what Trump is seeking. I mean, they're really promoting Tim Scott, who ran for president as a Republican and dropped out, I think, in October and November, and has been the most obsequious in his touting of Trump. So that, I think, is probably more likely. So, yeah, I mean, there's this odd kind of interregnum period in the campaign where the outcome is essentially decided. So nothing that could happen electorally will probably change the outcome. I mean, Trump is ahead like 60-30 essentially nationally and in most states. Nikki Haley might be able to get a couple of delegates here and there. So like if some extraneous event occurs and Trump is somehow like rendered unable to seek the presidency, then Nikki Haley will be the one who actually has some delegates and maybe can make a case for herself as she's the only alternative. I think that's probably the operating logic at this point. But you'll see in South Carolina, which I think is probably going to be completely consistent with what people assume. I think Trump is also at this point. People always balk when I say stuff like this, but Trump does have a lot of establishment support in terms of the party apparatus for the Republican Party. I mean, the RNC is basically under his control. The RNC chair endorsed Trump while there's still a competitive primary underway. And he's also getting more and more donor support. So, I think as strange as it seems, whatever recalcitrant elements of the Republican Party there might be in terms of having an antagonistic attitude toward Trump, they're probably going to be brought into the fold soon enough. And that will be strange because he's twice impeached and Russian asset and all this. But I doubt that will really change the basic structure of the race. So, yep.
I'll be fascinated also to hear as the months go on, Michael, your sort of comments on how the Biden campaign is shaping up as you get closer to the Democratic National Convention in the summer, because a lot of people are looking at the state of Joe Biden recently, just his kind of physical and mental state, and extremely worried. The polling shows that a lot of Democrats really didn't want him to run, yet he is running. So there's a lot of problems attached to that potentially. So that's interesting. There's a lot of speculation about last minute shuffling on the ticket, all sorts of things like this. So it'll be interesting to get your comments later as that sort of develops. We hope to carry this conversation on in the future. Michael Tracey, independent journalist. Before we go, Michael, give our listeners and viewers indication where they can find your work, your Substack. Give a shout out to where you can see you.
Yeah, I just relaunched my Substack recently, actually. It's at mtracey.net, mtracey.net. Just had a piece up yesterday. Had a news item in Newsweek this week. People can Google. And then also, I'm always, for better or worse, on Twitter/X. So that's at mtracey, mtracey.
We'll drop those links in the TNT chat community as well. Follow Michael on X, Twitter as well for the latest. You would definitely want to be following that account. Michael Tracey, thanks for joining us this week.
All right. Good to be with you.
There he goes, ladies and gentlemen. And top of the hour news headlines are coming up. On the other side, we'll be reconnecting with a couple of other expert guests and analysis in a number of things domestically and internationally. Stick around. We'll be back in just a few minutes.